It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast presented by DraftKings, the show that's so nice we do it twice. During the NFL season, regular season, we will do 2 episodes each and every week to make sure you know exactly who should and maybe shouldn't be in your fantasy football lineup, or even if you're playing DFS, you get the wisdom of who has a good matchup and who doesn't this week from our guy, John Daigle. Check him out on social media at NotJDaigle, Daigle, and check out all of not only his content, but all of his comrades over at EstablishTheRun.com. You know the guys, Adam Levitan, our former co-host Evan Silva. EstablishTheRun.com. Use that code FEAST for 5% off. You will be very, very happy that you did so. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman. You know that. 5 teams, 7 years. Hopefully you will check out Greg Cosell on today's Ross Tucker Football Podcast. He's always amazing. Tomorrow will be a Picks Friday where I will give you my picks each and every game, week 2 in the NFL, as well as a recap from tonight's game, which will be pretty easy to do because I'll be there. I'll be in the booth tonight for Westwood 1. Dolphins, Bills, national radio. Might even do my recap of the game from the stadium right after the game ends, which will be fun. Always fun teeing John up on the rest of these games, starting with 2 undefeated teams. The Seahawks are at the Patriots, John.
Teeing up usually means fantasy success, but I am thinking this game is going to be much slower. But let's start with the Patriots side of the ball because, unfortunately, we still really can't trust anyone through the air there. We know what their MO is. They want to play amazing defense, and they want to ride Ramondre Stevenson, who led every running back in week 1 and broken tackles. Genuinely looked incredible in a spot we talked about last week. Remember, Ross, we said without DJ Reader, the Bengals allowed over 5 yards per carry last year, and Ramondre took that stat and had a lot of success. I'm not sure it's going to be the same here, given the limited production the Broncos running backs just had between the tackles against the Seahawks. And so Ramondre Stevenson, while we are at least throwing him into our lineups as a top 24 running back based solely on the volume, really nothing else to trust here with the Patriots. On the other side of the ball, too, it's a little concerning for the Seahawks because we were hoping they had solved their problems in pass pro, especially since over the last calendar year, Geno Smith has really struggled when he's been under pressure. And Ryan Grubb at least showed us that, one, he's going to roll out Jackson Smith and Jigba and go heavy in 3 wide sets. The league's 11th highest rate of 11 personnel in week 1. But in spreading everyone out also, it leaves less room for protection in the back, and Geno Smith really once again was under pressure at a top 10 rate and really struggled when defenders got to him, which actually lowered Jackson Smith and Jigba's depth of target to just 3 yards in front of the line of scrimmage because Geno had no choice but to get it out as quickly as possible. So I don't think this is the matchup to focus on your Seattle wide receivers as ceiling plays. You're still throwing in DK Metcalf and JSN and Ken Walker, of course, assuming he plays with that abdomen injury, but honestly, not an upside potential. What we're really looking and waiting for is beyond this game, because I will say if Geno Smith is on the waiver wire, the schedule opens up against the Dolphins, Lions, and 49ers and 3 of their next 4. 3 opponents who will push them. So again, let's look for next week for the Seahawks, not this week.
God, I should have mentioned earlier, by the way, that John is presented by Labatt Blue Light. You know why? Because they want you to be able to just drink Labatt Blue Lights with your friends and enjoy your fantasy team kicking you-know-what. Always enjoy responsibly beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. We move on to the Jets and the Titans. You mentioned in episode 1 yesterday, John, about Breece Hall not doing what a lot of his fantasy owners were hoping.
And it's because the Jets were just shut out, basically, until the fourth quarter. Even Allen Lazard's production is misconstruing, given that One of his touchdowns came on a free play, and the other came from Tyrod Taylor. So Allen Lazard is not someone we're trusting here. Having said that, although the production was not there, Brees did play every snap until Braylon Allen came in for blowout purposes in the fourth quarter. So solely on the opportunity we're projecting him to see, Brees Hall is someone you are still trusting in your lineup, still an RB1. Don't worry about that. On the Titans side of the ball is where it gets interesting, because on one hand, Calvin Ridley did have a team-high 25.9% target share, as DeAndre Hopkins was very clearly still limited. And I expect him to be limited yet again, both in playing time and opportunity through the air in this one. But the boundary where Calvin Ridley is running most of his routes is exactly where you try to avoid here against Michael Carter and Sauce Gardner. So I am worried about Ridley's upside in this game. Who I don't worry about, at least in terms of usage, is Tony Pollard. Because all offseason, Titans coach Brian Callahan told us it was going to be a timeshare. Pollard and Tajay Spears are going to split the work. And that was not the case at all. Pollard outcarried Spears 16-4 and finished with 70% of Tennessee's backfield touches. So Pollard now I view closer in the RB2, top 24 range. Spears we have to leave on our bench.
Ooh, okay. Good to know. What about on the Jet side of things, John?
Outside of Brees Hall and Garrett Wilson, it's really tough. Again, given that Allen Lazard's production was farce, I believe. We think that Garrett Wilson is going to stay in the game more, not get removed for a blowout, and continue, as he showed in the first half, being hammered with targets, especially when trying to move the sticks from Rodgers. Wilson is someone I'm going back to, although Tennessee did show us that even without Mike Vrabel, they just still have dogs in their defense that are willing to get after it. That's why this game is not so exciting for fantasy. I'm expecting it to be very low scoring and rely on efficiency for the winning team to get there.
You know, it's interesting, this next matchup, which is, and by the way, I should point out that Aaron Rodgers was pretty outspoken that he needs to get the ball to Garrett Wilson even more. He needs to throw the ball to Garrett Wilson even more. So that will be something certainly to keep an eye on moving forward. As for this next matchup, the Giants and the Commanders, obviously curious to get your thoughts, John, but, you know, there was some thought or hope or whatever that perhaps these teams would have made strides since last year, and certainly week one it didn't really look that way.
Not at all. And again, we talked about Jaden Daniels in the last episode. Although he ended up getting there with the 2 rushing touchdowns, Cliff Kingsbury offense really stayed the same. Low depth of target, horizontal passing, not great for Terry McLaurin, who we thought would at least be the only player being used downfield. It turns out no one, at least in week one, got used downfield at all. So although Jaden Daniels will continue to get there in this game, especially since the Giants pass defense that we don't think can contain him, it's really hard to trust anyone outside of McLaurin and Washington's passing offense. On the other side of the ball, as odd as it's going to sound, I think I'm buying in to the Giants passing game in this one. Not just because Baker Mayfield had that incredible performance in week one as the week's overall QB2, but that's been a trend for Washington. Including that game from Mayfield, 15 of the last 17 quarterbacks to face the Commanders has finished as top 12 options in fantasy. The Commanders literally don't stop anyone under center. So as brutal as the Giants' offense looked against the Vikings, I do think Daniel Jones can be used in Superflex leagues as a QB2 this week, not only for the passing, but because he also, over his last 5 full starts, has averaged 8 carries per game. Malik Neighbors as well, who ran a route on literally every single one of Daniel Jones' dropbacks, can be trusted as a wide receiver 2 here, since Giants just allowed league-high fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So I have a little more trust, only for this week, in the Giants' passing game than you'll probably hear from others.
Just curious, John, where you're at with Jaden Daniels. I mean, I know you talked about Kingsbury and the horizontal passing, and I know they've been pretty clear they don't want Daniels running that much. But there's a lot of people that drafted Daniels, and he's their quarterback. Are you concerned at all, or is the running usage enough to say, hey, he's got a really high floor?
It's a double-edged sword because he has a high floor and ceiling combo. Again, even finishing as a top 10 quarterback for that rushing alone in week 1. But as you were suggesting, like, that kind of usage is going to get him hurt. It's not good that he was literally banging head on in the trenches, like behind his center. So I am worried long term, but it's a player that we just have to continue starting weekly and just hope the passing game opens up downfield. Because he showed us, like, unlike Anthony Richardson last year, who, again, as a passer completed just 59% of his passes, Jane Daniels showed us he's already a good passer. They just have to open it up.
Let's move on and let's get to the Rams at the Cardinals. There's a lot to get to here, including the fact that Puka Nacua was placed on IR, and Matthew Stafford, it felt like he threw the ball to Cooper Kupp every play. Congratulations to those people who drafted Cooper Kupp. As for the Cardinals, I did that game on CBS. Marvin Harrison, 3 targets, 1 catch, 4 yards. It was not the debut that Cardinals or their fans were hoping for.
It looked like a player who didn't play much in the preseason and didn't have many reps throughout the offseason. That's what it looked like, a rookie receiver. I am not panicking on the Cardinals' passing offense just yet, especially since their schedule continues to be driven by having to pass the ball. Elite offenses coming into town over the next 2 months even. So I would actually suggest buying low wherever you can on Kyler Murray and all of his receivers, Trey McBride included. I know some people were freaking out about McBride, 5 catches, 30 yards, but I would argue he had the best behind-the-scenes usage of any tight end in the league. 29% target share, 89% route rate. Trust Kyler Murray in the passing offense, especially in this game where I think we're going to have some fireworks. My real concern here is what the Rams can do being so banged up. Because I know fantasy players know who Puka Nacua is, and his absence for the next at least 4 weeks on injured reserve, who knows what his actual recovery timeline is, certainly puts a dent into things. But what they might not know is that the Rams' offensive line right now is in shambles. Right tackle Rob Havenstein missed week 1 with an ankle injury. Left tackle Joe Noteboom was carted off in week 1 with a high ankle sprain. Kevin Dotson's now day-to-day with an ankle sprain. Steve Avila is headed to injured reserve, and Alaric Jackson is still suspended for 1 more week. So although the Cardinals' defense was atrocious against Buffalo, they allowed a league-high 14 plays of 10 yards last week. I'm worried about Stafford here. I think he could be under duress a lot more than people suggest. So I'm trying to parse between like which Rams wide receivers are going to step up in place of Nacua. I think it's in order Demarcus Robinson, who has quietly led the team in end zone targets from week 12 on, including last week when he stepped in place of Puka, and then Tyler Johnson, who came off the bench for 7 targets. But really, it's Kyron Williams and Cooper Kupp. Those are the 2 guys to trust right now.
Here's what I know and trust. Smirnoff. It's the perfect vodka for crafting delicious cocktails that are easy to make and versatile for any and all fans over 21. It's the world's #1 vodka. They've been around since 1864. They do game days. Grab a bottle of Smirnoff at your local retailer. Head to Smirnoff.com to find recipes of delicious cocktails perfect for game day. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff No. 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Please do not share with anyone under legal drinking age. Anything else on the Cardinals that needs to be mentioned?
If we think the Cardinals can sneakily hang around, they showed us what they want to do in a neutral game script or with a lead, and giving James Conner 8 touches on their opening drive, including the ball in their first 6 plays. So James Conner could be an RB1 in this game if we do think, again, the Cardinals can hang around and play defense.
Next matchup, it's the Steelers at the Broncos. Very curious to get your thoughts on both of these offenses, John.
It's going to be interesting because historically Justin Fields has really struggled against the blitz, and the Broncos sent the hell out of the blitz, literally led the league in week 1 against Geno Smith and the Seahawks. But although Justin Fields was 26th in passing yards in the season opener, he still finishes the QB 16 in fantasy, because when you get double-digit carries, including his 14 yards, that's what rushing production does in fantasy. So assuming Justin Fields gets the start again here, you have to play him for his rushing floor. And he only goes to one player. That's the best part about the Steelers' offense, is that George Pickens had a 30% target share, 15.5 yards downfield was his average depth of target. He just gets deep shots all the time, and he's so good that even when the ball is off track, as you noticed in the film, he comes down with it every time. So George Pickens, Justin Fields connection, those are the two guys who I am least concerned about in this offense, regardless of how good this Broncos secondary is. On the other side of the ball, Bo Nix, absolutely, there's no doubt, had a poor showing in week 1. And I'm very worried again about this matchup, since we just saw what the Steelers did to the Falcons. We'll get to Kirk Cousins here in a bit later on this show. But at least in terms of the Broncos running backs, I think something happened that people may have not noticed. And that was really a changing of the guard. We knew Jaleel McLaughlin was going to lead the team in target share and snaps on third down, which he did, as their pass catching back. But what we did not expect is a team-high 10 carries to Javonte Williams' 8. And more important, whenever this game between the Broncos and Seahawks was within 6 points of one another, McLaughlin actually outcarried Javonte Williams 9-7. He was the back that they used whenever it was most important to use him, not just as a pass-catching option. So I think Jaleel may be the starter in that backfield. And if that's the case, he's an immediate RB3 and flex option in this matchup.
Ooh, boy, that is interesting, because all the talk had been that Javonte Williams looked like he was fully healthy, looked like he was all the way back from his injury. So I'll be curious to see whether or not that continues moving forward. And is Justin Fields usable as a quarterback, John?
Yes, I do believe so. Again, just a pass for 150 yards and still finishes the QB 16. When you get the 14 carries that he did last week, you just fire him up as a QB2 in your Superflex leagues and forget about it.
Okay, this next matchup is interesting, right? It's been one of the marquee games in the NFL in recent years. It's the Cincinnati Bengals, who only managed 10 points against the Patriots on Sunday. They are at the Chiefs. It's the featured 4:25 p.m. Eastern Time game on Sunday. Tony Romo, Jim Nantz, Tracy Wolfson on CBS. What are we looking for here? Do you expect the Bengals offense to bounce back, John?
I'm hoping so, to get a fun and competitive game here. But what the Bengals showed us in week 1, I think it may be too early for this matchup. Joe Burrow even, he was kept clean on 70% of his dropbacks, wasn't under pressure, and he still averaged 5.5 yards per attempt on those 25 throws, just pathetically dumping it off underneath. So in this matchup, I'm not sure I trust him, to be quite honest. I think he's closer to a QB2, and there may be even better options on your waiver wire if you play in one QB thin leagues here. Having said that, his pass catching options, we at least know where he goes, because we expect Jamar Chase's usage, snap rate, to increase in this one after he was limited in week 1. And Andre Yoshivas, who we discussed last week, didn't get in the box score, but he did run a route on every single one of Joe Burrow's dropbacks. Those are the two pass catchers, assuming T. Higgins remains out, which it definitely sounds like he's still going to be sidelined with that hamstring injury. Not only that, but although the Ravens didn't have much success running the ball with Derrick Henry, got in for a touchdown, but he wasn't too successful in terms of efficiency, we at least know that the Bengals last week leaned on Zach Moss well ahead of Chase Brown. Brown really just being their pass-catching back, and instead it was Moss who outcarried him 9-3. So Zach Moss also someone to use as an RB2-3 in this matchup. What I really think is going to happen here is the Chiefs are going to play sound defense and run the ball heavily and have the same success with Isaiah Pacheco that Ramondre Stevenson did. Pacheco last week, 17 of the team's 20 backfield touches. Also, Rashee Rice, we're getting this condensed target share now with Travis Kelce, who still looked good, but played limited snaps, opened up the door a little bit for backup tight end Jared Wiley to get in there. And what really has happened is the target tree is now going to Xavier Worthy, who had those 2 touchdowns, including a coverage breakdown, because if you don't notice, you don't have a guy over the top of Xavier Worthy, his 4.21 speed just burns you immediately. There's no time to recover. And Rashee Rice, That's the player we need to talk about because now, over his last 11 games, Rice is the wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game. Literally a wide receiver 1 alongside A.J. Brown. So, in my opinion, it's going to be Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy to a lesser extent, and riding Pacheco to the win.
Well, I got to ask you because he's from my alma mater. I know he didn't have the box score. What did you notice? Anything from Yosivash?
Again, the Bengals passing game was so limited, and Joe Burrow was poor under pressure with Jared Mayo. They absolutely got to him that nothing really stands out outside of he was still the one that was successful when they could get the ball to him. But they really just moved Jamar Chase closer to the line of scrimmage and were just peppering him to make sure Joe Burrow stayed upright.
All right, let's get to the Bears and the Texans. Bears, obviously, that was not very impressive offensively. A lot of struggles for Caleb Williams. Now they play a Texans team. How about Joe Mixon? We're going right from the Bengals to the Texans. The Texans really were riding Joe Mixon, John.
And I think it's another game where they can ride him successfully. Where the Bears' elite defense really struggled last week was the ground. Tony Pollard, we mentioned earlier, 16 carries for over 5 yards per carry. Tajay Spears also, although he only had 4 carries, averaged over 5 yards per pop. Even Will Levis averaged over 5 yards per carry as well. And so if we're going to be that loose in between the trenches, I think Joe Mixon can ride pretty successfully here. So I like Joe Mixon again. We're not going to get 79 plays from the Texans. That's absolutely an anomaly based on how their offense is constructed. But if they can just stay ahead and still force Caleb Williams under pressure, then yes, Joe Mixon is a player to absolutely trust. And although you'd have to buy him high, someone that I do think could be a low-end RB1 absolutely the rest of the way based on his usage. Through the air is where it gets a little bit more confusing because everyone, Tank Dell, Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, unsurprisingly out there for an 85% route rate, just glued to the field in 3 wide sets. And we talked about last week how I thought Diggs was going to be the most successful as the slot receiver who could settle into the zone pockets against Gus Bradley. But I don't think that's the case this week, given the elite Bears passing defense. I expect one of the boundary receivers, in my opinion, it's going to be Tank Dell, who gets more pre-snap motion than the others to have the most success through the air. But I still have all the respect in the world for this Bears secondary and pass rush. So instead, for me, it's going to be Joe Mixon as the player who's going to produce the most here.
What about the Bears offensively, John?
It's a struggle right now limping into this game. Keenan Allen dealing with a heel injury. Roma Dunze week to week with a knee injury. So behind DJ Moore, it really only is DeAndre Carter, who ran 5 routes last week. Tyler Scott, their 4th rounder from a couple years ago, was healthy scratched in week 1. He'll be active this game. And then Colin Johnson, who had a very successful preseason, is on their practice squad, probably getting the call up midweek. It's not good. But what it does lead to is a very condensed target share, all for DJ Moore, and just hope that Shane Waldron makes it easier on Caleb Williams, since week 1 was very clearly an underwhelming debut and a struggle. Some odd things from Waldron in that week 1 game as well. Cole Kmet ran fewer routes than Gerald Everett. Velus Jones, 25-year-old wide receiver, had as many carries as Khalil Herbert. It was just concerning usage for Waldron's debut in Chicago.
Last but not least, Falcons did not look good against the Steelers. Now they go into Philly to take on the Eagles.
And we got what we wanted from the Eagles. Let's start there because top 5 in plays per game against the Packers in week 1. Saquon Barkley as an every-touch explosive workhorse. A.J. Brown dominating on the outside. Devonta Smith with 71% of his routes from the slot and that power role that Keenan Allen and CeeDee Lamb were so successful in under Kellen Moore. Everything still aligns for this game for all of those players to be startable and have immense production against the Falcons. I think what everyone wants to really know is which Falcons can they trust? And I'm removing Kirk Cousins from that one, given how injured he still looked and being unable to plant his foot. I think for right now, I would even start Justin Fields, even Daniel Jones in the matchup we talked about on the last episode, over Kirk Cousins in Superflex leagues. But given their route rates, Kyle Pitts, Drake London on the field for literally every route that Kirk Cousins dropped back for, I am trusting Kyle Pitts and London for one more week in your lineups.
Wow. That is really interesting. I've seen videos of Cousins, and it's a little bit surprising, but you never know how any of these guys really come back from injuries. It's a good point, John. Check him out. He makes a lot of good points over at EstablishTheRun.com. They all do. And use the code FEAST for 5% off. You can follow him on social media like I do, at NotJDaigle. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. Make sure you're checking out all the other shows between now and Sunday. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.